It was just another routine interview after a Warriors victory, until Jennifer Walsh, a veteran reporter known for her direct questions, asked the question that changed everything. Steph, what is your biggest regret in life? The silence that followed was so profound that you could hear the humming of the cameras. Nobody was prepared for what would happen next. You can perceive that there are moments in life when a simple question has the power to completely change the course of a conversation, of a day, even of an entire perspective on what really matters. The press room at Chase Center was bustling with its usual post-game movement. Steph Curry had just left the court after one of the most spectacular performances of the season. 42 points, 8 assists, and 6 three-point shots that left the crowd in ecstasy. Sweat still glistened on his forehead when he sat before the microphone, that characteristic smile lighting up his face. Robert Kim, the Warriors' press liaison, checked his watch and made the usual signal to the journalists. 15 minutes, everyone. Let's begin. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive. Steph was clearly in good spirits, still energized by the victory and the performance that had enchanted the fans. The first questions flowed naturally, as always happened after games like that one. Steph, in the third quarter, you made 3 consecutive shots from almost 10 meters away. What was going through your head? Asked Carlos Mendez from The Athletic. Man, I was just in rhythm, responded Steph, gesticulating animatedly. Sometimes the basket looks gigantic, and you know that anything you throw up is going in. Nights like this are special because you feel like you're playing basketball in the purest possible way. Anthony Zhang from ESPN asked the second question. Speaking of rhythm, you guys seem to have found a special chemistry on offense today. Was this something worked on in practice, or did it emerge naturally in the game? Steph leaned forward, clearly appreciating the opportunity to talk about basketball. A little bit of both, actually. We've been working on some offensive variations in practice, but today, everything flowed organically. When you have teammates who understand the game like Draymond and Clay, basketball becomes almost telepathic. Naturally, this leads us to an interesting observation about routine moments. They give us a false sense of predictability, making us forget that life has a unique way of surprising us exactly when we least expect it. James Wilson, a veteran from NBA.com, continued with technical questions. Steph, you broke the record for 3-point shots in consecutive games today. Does this kind of milestone still mean something to you? Or are you focused only on team objectives? Look, it's always cool to break records, said Steph, smiling. But honestly, what excites me most are the victories. Individual records are a consequence of playing the right basketball and helping the team win. If I can achieve some marks along the way, great, but that's not what drives me. The conversation followed its natural and predictable rhythm. Questions about strategy, about the next game, about the team's physical condition. Steph responded with the ease of someone who had given thousands of similar interviews throughout his career. How is it possible that 15 years of experience in press conferences hadn't prepared any of the people in that room for what was about to happen? For almost 10 minutes, everything transpired exactly as everyone expected. Professional, polite, focused on the sport. Sarah Mitchell from ESPN asked about playoff preparation. Daniel Patel from the San Francisco Chronicle wanted to know about tactical changes implemented by the coach. Matthew Brown from the Mercury News inquired about recovery from a minor injury Steph had suffered the previous month. Technical answers, tactical analyses, comments. About teammates. It was the familiar symphony of post-game interviews, played with the precision of musicians who know every note by heart. Robert Kim looked at his watch again. 5 minutes remaining. 2 or 3 more questions, and they could wrap up. Steph answered a question about player rotation, another about defensive strategy, and everything seemed to be heading toward a calm and predictable ending. That's when Jennifer Walsh raised her hand. Have you ever wondered how some people carry a presence that immediately changes the energy of an environment? Jennifer had 30 years of experience covering professional sports. She had interviewed everyone from Michael Jordan to LeBron James, always with a direct style that went beyond the superficial questions that dominated most press conferences. When she raised her hand, there was something different in her posture. It wasn't the casual body language of someone wanting to ask a routine question about basketball. It was the posture of someone who had something important to say. "Steph," she said, her voice cutting through the casual murmur of the room, "can I ask a more personal question?" Her tone made everyone in the room shift slightly in their chairs. Steph leaned forward, intrigued but still smiling. "Sure, Jennifer. Go ahead." Great moments in life are often preceded by a silence that seems to carry all the weight of what's to come. Jennifer paused for a second, looked directly into Steph's eyes, and asked the he question that would change not only the course of that interview, but the way everyone in the room would see the man sitting before them. "Steph, what is your biggest regret in life?" The silence that followed was different from any other that had ever happened in that room. It wasn't the silence of someone processing a question about basketball. It was the silence of someone who had just been confronted with something much deeper and more significant. What's most impressive is how a question can instantly transport us from one mental place to another, completely different one. In a fraction of a second, Steph was no longer in the Chase Center press room. He was somewhere much more vulnerable, much more real. You can perceive that the air in the room had completely changed. The cameras continued recording, but now they were capturing something very different from what they had registered in the previous minutes. The journalists, who seconds before were taking casual notes about plays and statistics, were now completely motionless, sensing that something important was about to happen. Steph looked at Jennifer, then at the cameras, then at his own hands. The smile had completely disappeared from his face, replaced by an expression that mixed surprise, reflection, and something that seemed to be an old pain resurfacing. The humming of the cameras, which always went unnoticed during normal interviews, now seemed amplified in the absolute silence of the room. Reporters who would normally be checking their phones or preparing the next question were completely focused on the man before them, realizing they were about to witness something rare in the world of professional sports: genuine vulnerability. Robert Kim, who had conducted hundreds of these press conferences, felt a tightness in his stomach. He had known Steph for years and could see that the question had hit something deep. Part of him wanted to intervene, protect his client, keep things in the safe territory of basketball. But something in Steph's expression made him remain silent. Great moments in life are often preceded by a silence that seems to last an eternity, but actually lasts only a few seconds. Steph took a deep breath, looked at Jennifer again, and something in his eyes changed completely. It was as if he had made a decision, not just about how to answer that specific question, but about what kind of person he wanted to be in that moment, in front of those cameras, in front of millions of people who would watch later. And it was then that Steph Curry, three-time NBA champion, idol to millions, began to talk about something he had never mentioned publicly. Something that would change not only the course of that interview, but the way everyone present would see vulnerability, humanity, and what really matters in life. What Steph answered next not only surprised everyone in the room, but revealed a vulnerability that few had ever seen from the star. It was as if a door that had remained closed for years, suddenly opened, letting escape something deep and painful that he had been carrying in silence. Steph looked down for a moment, his hands intertwining almost imperceptibly. When he raised his eyes again, there was something different there. It was no longer the confident Steph Curry who had entered the room 15 minutes earlier. It was a man confronting something he preferred to keep stored away. "My biggest regret?" he repeated, as if he were hearing the question for the first time, although Jennifer had just asked it. His voice had lost the casual and relaxed tone of the previous minutes. Now it carried a weight that made everyone in the room lean slightly forward. You can perceive that there are moments in life when we are forced to look at our own vulnerability, and these moments instantly transform us from public personas into real human beings. Steph paused again, breathing deeply as if preparing to dive into deep waters. "It's not having spent more time with my grandfather before he died." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. If before it was expectation, now it was pure respect for something sacred that was being shared. Jennifer Walsh, who had asked the question, remained completely motionless, realizing she had triggered something much bigger than a simple interview response. Steph continued, his voice beginning to choke in a way that no one in that room had ever seen. "He passed away 3 years ago during the 2021 playoffs. It was April. We were in an intense sequence of games, and I was completely obsessed with the season. My head was only on basketball, only on winning the title." It's impossible not to feel that some confessions carry decades of repressed pain. Steph wasn't just telling a story. He was reliving one of the most painful moments of his life in front of cameras that would transmit his vulnerability to millions of people. "My grandfather, David Clark, lived in Charlotte. He was 86 years old and had been showing signs that his health was fragile. My mother would call me almost every week saying, 'Steph, you should come visit your grandfather. He always asks when you're going to show up.'" Steph's voice trembled slightly when he mentioned his grandfather's name. It was evident that talking about David Clark touched something deeply personal, a connection that transcended basketball, fame, or any professional achievement. "I always answered the same thing. 'After the playoffs, Mom. After the season ends, I'm going to spend a whole week with him. We'll go fishing. We'll talk. I'll show him all the videos of the games he missed.' Always after the playoffs." Naturally, this leads us to a painful truth about human priorities. Sometimes we convince ourselves that there will always be an after for the things that really matter, without realizing that time doesn't negotiate with our ambitions. Christopher Lee from the ABUE, Sacramento Bee, who was in the second row, completely lowered his notepad. He had covered sports for 15 years and had never witnessed a moment like that in a press conference. It was no longer about basketball, it was about the human condition in its rawest form. Steph cleared his throat, trying to maintain composure, but it was obvious that each word was costing considerable emotional effort. "The last conversation we had was by phone, on a Tuesday night. He had watched our game against the Lakers and wanted to talk about a specific play I had made. He always watched all the games, always had something technical to comment on. What's most impressive is how specific memories can become sources of permanent pain when they transform into last times." Steph was reliving not just a conversation, but the last moment of connection he had with someone he clearly loved deeply. "He said he was proud of me, that I was playing the best basketball of my career. He said that my grandmother, who had died 2 years earlier, would be radiant seeing how I was performing. And then he said something I never forgot. 'Steph, when all this is over, when you're no longer playing, come visit me. I have some stories about our family that I want to tell you." Steph's voice broke slightly on the word stories. It was evident that this part of the conversation had become a particular source of torment for him. "I was leaving practice in a hurry because I had a scheduled physical therapy session. My mind was completely on the next game, on the playoffs, on the possibility of reaching the finals. And I said to him, 'Of course, Grandpa. After this season ends, we'll have all the time in the world to talk. Now I have to run. But after the playoffs, I'll come there, and you can tell me all the stories you want.'" Great moments in life are often preceded by a silence. But sometimes they're followed by even deeper silences, loaded with regret and late understanding. He died 2 days later. The 4 words came out of Steph's mouth like a whisper that echoed through the entire room. There was no dramatic preparation, no construction, just the naked truth that had haunted Steph for 3 years. Timothy Walker, a veteran from the Associated Press, felt a lump in his throat. In 40 years covering sports, he had witnessed moments of glory, sporting tragedy, controversies, but never something as deeply human as that. "Heart attack during sleep," continued Steph, now speaking as if he were alone in the room, processing the loss for the 1,000th time. "My mother called me at 5 in the morning. I was sleeping because we had a game that night. When I answered the phone and heard her crying, I immediately knew what had happened. Have you ever wondered what the exact moment is like when we realize we've lost forever the chance to correct something important?" Steph was sharing not just a loss, but the precise moment when he understood that some opportunities never return. "The worst part is that I went to the funeral, saw all the people he had impacted throughout his life, heard the stories others told about him, and realized that I, the grandson he loved most, was the one who knew least about who he really was." The pain in Steph's voice was almost tangible. Every person in the room could feel the weight of the regret he carried, the frustration with himself for having prioritized the temporary over the eternal. "And the part that hurts most," said Steph, his voice now clearly choked, "is that I never had my second conversation with him. I never heard the stories about our family. I never had the chance to say that I loved him and that he was one of the most important people in my life, because I was always too busy being Steph Curry, the basketball player." Benjamin Lewis from The Athletic looked around the room and noticed that several colleagues were visibly emotional. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were looking down, processing their own memories and regrets that Steph's confession had awakened. It's impossible not to feel that some universal truths hit us with full force when they're expressed with brutal honesty. Steph wasn't just talking about his own experience. He was touching a wound that almost all adults carry: the regret of not having valued time with people we love more while it was still possible. "Since then," continued Steph, trying to recompose his voice, "I carry this pain every day. Not just missing him, but anger at myself for being so selfish, so myopic, for believing there would always be a next time, a next conversation, a next opportunity." The silence in the room was now different from anything any of them had ever experienced in a press conference. It wasn't discomfort, it was deep respect for someone who had chosen to be completely vulnerable when he could have given a safe and superficial answer. Great moments in life are often preceded by a silence. And in that moment, Steph Curry had transformed a press room into a sacred space where human vulnerability was being completely honored. Jennifer Walsh, who had asked the question that triggered all of that, looked at Steph with a mixture of gratitude and responsibility. She had expected an interesting answer, but hadn't prepared to witness such a deep and transformative confession. And everyone in the room knew that something had changed forever. Not just in the way they saw Steph Curry, but in the way they were, being forced to examine their own priorities and regrets. What happened in the press room at that moment was something none of those present would ever forget. It was as if Steph's confession had opened an emotional door that completely transformed the nature of that encounter, creating a human connection that transcended any professional protocol. The silence that followed Steph's revelation was different from anything those veteran journalists had ever experienced. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of a difficult question without an answer, but the sacred silence of people processing a deep truth that had touched their own unhealed wounds. Jennifer Walsh, the veteran reporter who had asked the question, had tears in her eyes. In 30 years covering sports, she had witnessed moments of triumph and tragedy, but never something as raw and honest as that. Her right hand trembled slightly when she lowered the recorder, realizing she was no longer conducting an interview. She was witnessing a confession. You can perceive that there are moments in life when one person's genuine vulnerability creates an energy field that transforms everyone around. That was exactly what was happening in that room. Marcus Williams, an ESPN reporter who had covered the NBA for 15 years, was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat, looked directly at Steph, and did something completely against journalistic protocol. "Steph," said Marcus, his voice loaded with emotion, "thank you for sharing this with us. I lost my father last year, and I know exactly how you feel." Marcus's statement created a total rupture in the unwritten rules of press conferences. Journalists don't share personal experiences during interviews. They ask questions, get answers, maintain professional distance. But in that moment, all these conventions seemed irrelevant in the face of the raw humanity that had taken over the room. Steph looked at Marcus with an expression of deep gratitude. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and there was a sincerity in his voice that went far beyond the formal condolences we usually offer. "He was also always saying we would talk more after I finished covering the season," continued Marcus, his own voice beginning to fail. "Always after the season, Dad. After the playoffs. And when the season ended, it was already too late." What's most impressive is how one person's vulnerability can give permission for others to share their own hidden pains. It was as if Steph had created a safe space where professional masks could be removed. Sarah Mitchell from Sports Illustrated, who was sitting in the front row, raised her hand hesitantly. "Can I say something off the record?" she asked, looking alternately at Steph and at Robert Kim, who seemed completely lost about how to handle the situation. Steph nodded yes, before Robert could even respond. "I have an 8-year-old daughter," said Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. "She always complains that I work too much, that I'm always traveling to cover games, always busy with deadlines and stories. Your answer just made me realize that maybe she's right. Maybe I'm repeating the same mistake you made, that Marcus made, that so many of us make. It's impossible not to feel that some truths are universal enough to cross all professional barriers and touch the core of human experience." The room had transformed into a kind of collective therapy session where people who normally maintained professional distance were sharing their deepest vulnerabilities. Daniel Patel from The Chronicle, a normally reserved man who rarely spoke during press conferences, leaned forward. "Steph, can I ask a question that has nothing to do with basketball?" "Sure," responded Steph, and it was evident that he was more comfortable with this new direction of the conversation than with any tactical analysis he could have made. "How do you deal with this pain? How do you find peace with a regret that can't be corrected? Daniel's question echoed through the room as if each person present was asking the same question to themselves. Because isn't it incredible how we all carry regrets we wish we could undo? Steph breathed deeply, clearly thinking carefully about his response. Honestly, some days are harder than others. But what I've learned is that I can't change what happened with my grandfather. What I can do is make sure I don't make the same mistake with other people I love. Great moments in life are often preceded by a silence. But sometimes they're followed by revelations that change our perspective forever. Since he died, continued Steph, I've completely changed my priorities. When my children want to play, I drop everything. When Isha wants to talk, when she needs attention, I stop everything. Because I learned the hard way that titles you can win again, records you can break again, but lost time with those you love, that never comes back. Anthony Jang, the camera technician who was recording everything, lowered his camera for a moment. In 10 years filming sports interviews, he had never witnessed something so profound. Part of him felt like he was invading a private moment, even knowing he was doing his job. Christopher Lee, who had been taking notes automatically throughout the interview, stopped writing completely. He realized he was trying to capture something that transcended words, something that needed to be felt more than documented. Jennifer Walsh, who had started everything with her question, finally found her voice again. Steph, can I say something personally? Of course. My mother is 72 years old and lives alone in Ohio. It's been 3 months since I talked to her because I'm always too busy covering games and writing stories. Your regret just made me realize I'm doing exactly what you did. Naturally, this leads us to a devastating truth about the human condition. How many times do we learn important lessons through other people's pain, only to realize we're making the same mistakes? Call her today, said Steph, looking directly into Jennifer's eyes. Not tomorrow, not next week. Today, because you never know if you'll have another opportunity. Steph's advice didn't sound like motivational platitude. It sounded like wisdom gained through real suffering, through a lesson that had cost the highest price possible. Timothy Walker, who had been silently observing the entire interaction, raised his hand. Steph, have you ever said this publicly before? Never, responded Steph immediately. I've never talked about my grandfather in any interview. It's something I carry with me, something that, something that hurts too much to talk about. What made you decide to share today? Steph looked around the room, seeing faces that no longer showed the typical professional neutrality of journalists. They were faces of human beings who had been touched by his vulnerability. I think because I realized that keeping this pain just to myself doesn't honor my grandfather's memory, said Steph. If my experience can help one person not make the same mistake, then maybe something good can come from this pain I carry. It's impossible not to feel that some of life's most important lessons are learned through regret. And when someone has the courage to share these regrets publicly, it creates an opportunity for others to avoid the same pain. Matthew Brown, normally focused only on statistics and technical analyses, made an observation that surprised everyone. Steph, in 15 years covering sports, this is the most important conversation I've ever witnessed. It has nothing to do with basketball, but everything to do with life. The entire room nodded in agreement. Everyone knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that completely transcended the world of sports and touched the core of human experience. Robert Kim, who had remained silent during this entire transformation, finally spoke. Folks, I know this is far beyond what normally happens in these press conferences, but this is too important to be interrupted. Have you ever wondered how some moments in life are so powerful that even the people responsible for maintaining protocols recognize that something bigger is happening? That was exactly what Robert had perceived. Great moments in life are often preceded by a silence. And in that moment, a press room in a basketball arena had become a place where deep truths about love, loss, and priorities were being shared with an honesty that would forever change how everyone present would see their own lives. And everyone knew that Steph Curry had given them much more than an interview. He had given them a lesson about what really matters in life, a lesson worth more than any sports headline they could write. What happened after this revelation proved that sometimes life's most powerful moments happen when we simply decide to be human in front of other humans. And when this happens in public, with cameras recording, the impact transcends anything we could imagine. The interview that had begun as a post-game routine had transformed into something completely different. There were no more questions about specific plays, tactical strategies, or performance analyses. Instead, it had become a deep conversation about life, loss, priorities, and the courage to recognize our deepest regrets. Robert Kim looked at his watch and realized they had already exceeded the normal time of a press conference by 20 minutes. But when he looked around the room, he saw something he had never seen before. Nobody was in a hurry to leave. Everyone seemed to understand they were witnessing something rare and important. You can perceive that there are moments in life when time seems to stop because something transcendent is happening. That was exactly what everyone in the room was experiencing. Steph looked at everyone present and did something no professional athlete had ever done in a press conference. He stood up from his chair, not to leave, but to speak standing, looking directly into the eyes of each person present. "You know what?" he said, his voice now firmer, as if he had found new strength through the vulnerability he had shared. "You always ask me about my records, my titles, my three-point shots. But today I discovered that the most important question anyone can ask is, are you dedicating time to what really matters?" The silence that followed was no longer loaded with sadness, but with deep reflection. Each person in the room was being forced to examine their own priorities, their own regrets, their own choices about how to spend the most precious time they had. And my answer to that question has changed a lot since I lost my grandfather, continued Steph. Before, I would have said yes. Of course I'm prioritizing what matters. After all, I'm working hard, achieving things, building a legacy. But now I know that real legacy isn't what you build on a basketball court. Jennifer Walsh, who had initiated this entire transformation with her question, was taking notes, but not about basketball. She was writing personal reflections that conversation had awakened in her. "Real legacy," said Steph, looking directly at the cameras, knowing that millions of people would watch later, "is the time you spend with the people you love. It's the conversations you have, the memories you create, the presence you offer when someone needs you." Naturally, this leads us to a fundamental truth about human value. Steph Curry, one of the most famous athletes in the world, was using his platform not to talk about his achievements, but to completely redefine what success means. Marcus Williams, who had shared his own loss, raised his hand once more. "Steph, what advice would you give to parents who are watching this and who might be making the same mistake you made?" Marcus's question echoed through the room as if each person present was asking the same question to themselves and to their own families. Steph breathed deeply, clearly thinking carefully about his response. "First, Stop using the word after. After the playoffs, after the promotion, after the project ends. There's no guaranteed after. There's only now. It's impossible not to feel that some advice carries the weight of lessons learned through real pain. Steph's words didn't sound like superficial motivation, but like wisdom gained through genuine suffering. Second, he continued, remember that your children won't remember the titles you won at work. They'll remember if you were present in their important moments. And more importantly, they'll remember if you were present in the simple moments too. Sarah Mitchell, who had mentioned her 8-year-old daughter, had tears in her eyes. It was evident that Steph's words were resonating deeply with her own situation as a mother, who worked intensely. And third, said Steph, his voice carrying a conviction that came from painful experience. If you have grandparents, parents, older people in the family you love, go visit them. Today. Not tomorrow, not next weekend. Today. Because time is the only gift we can't recover when we lose it. What's most impressive is how some simple truths can sound revolutionary when expressed with total authenticity. Steph wasn't offering empty platitudes. He was sharing lessons he had learned the hardest way possible. Timothy Walker asked one last question that captured everyone's feeling in the room. Steph, how do you want people to remember this conversation? Steph looked around the room one last time, seeing faces that had been transformed by the honesty he had chosen to share. I want them to remember that Steph Curry is a basketball player who learned that being a good player will never be more important than being a good grandson, a good husband, a good father. And that lesson costs the highest price that exists. The time I'll never have back. Great moments in life are often preceded by a silence. But sometimes they end with a clarity that changes our perspective forever. If there's one thing you can write about me, said Steph, preparing to leave, write this, that one day I chose to be vulnerable publicly because I understood that my pain could help other people not go through the same experience I went through. The room remained silent while Steph headed for the door. But before leaving, he turned around one last time. And Jennifer, he said, looking at the reporter who had asked the question that changed everything, thank you for having the courage to ask the right question. Sometimes we need someone brave enough to force us to look at our own truth. Jennifer nodded, visibly moved, understanding that she had witnessed and participated in something that completely transcended sports journalism. When Steph left the room, nobody moved. Immediately. It was as if everyone needed a moment to process what had just happened. Have you ever wondered how some moments in life create waves that spread far beyond the initial moment? In the hours and days that followed, Steph's interview went viral, not just for being emotional, but for touching a universal truth about human priorities. Jennifer Walsh really did call her mother that same night, a 2-hour conversation she hadn't had in years. Sarah Mitchell canceled a work trip to spend the weekend with her daughter. Marcus Williams visited his father's grave for the first time since the funeral. But the most lasting impact was in how everyone present came to see Steph Curry. He had ceased to be just an extraordinary athlete to become an example of how vulnerability can be a form of courage, how admitting our failures can be more powerful than celebrating our successes. It's impossible not to feel that some of life's most important conversations happen when someone has the courage to admit they don't have all the answers, that they made mistakes, that they carry real regrets. And that's how a simple question in a post-game interview transformed into a lesson about what really matters in life. A lesson that began with regret, passed through vulnerability, and ended with the wisdom that great moments in life are often preceded by a silence, but can be followed by transformations that last forever. Because sometimes the most courageous thing we can do is simply be human in front of other humans. And when we do that, we discover that our vulnerability doesn't make us weak. It makes us real.